From studios at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, this is Fourth and State. In this edition, Craig Gilbert, the Washington bureau chief of the Journal-Sentinel, chats with me about the upcoming election. Hi, I'm David Haynes. I'm the editorial page editor at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Welcome to Fourth and State. I'm joined today by Craig Gilbert, the Washington bureau chief for the Journal-Sentinel, who also writes the Wisconsin Voter blog. Craig, welcome.
Thanks. Nice to be with you.
So you wrote a blog post this morning that analyzed the new Marquette poll and some other polls that we've been seeing. Let's start with the presidential race first. The poll shows Obama up about 8 points in Wisconsin.
Right.
Other polls have some different readings, but Obama has consistently been ahead. Is Wisconsin still in play at this point?
Yeah, it's in play. I mean, we don't know what the margin is. I mean, the most challenging or concerning thing for the Romney campaign is not the margin in any individual poll, because it varies. It's really the fact that they really haven't been ahead in any of the polls,
right,
certainly in the last couple of months. And so, you know, they've been tied in a few polls, they've been behind by 1 or 2 points in a few polls, they've been behind by more than that in some polls, but just, you know, it's always a little concerning when all the polls are kind of pointing in the same direction. So it's a close race, but it's been a kind of persistently close margin for Obama, which, you know, by looking at the public polling alone gives him the upper hand in Wisconsin.
Going back months.
Yeah.
In fact. Now, I saw Charles Franklin talked a lot about sort of intensive voters. Could you talk a bit about that? Because he said the poll margin actually narrows quite a bit when you look only at those voters. Who are those voters and what does that mean?
He's taking within the population of likely voters, he's looking then at people who pay the most attention to politics. So when you just take the likely voters who pay the most attention, the margin in his poll narrows from 8 to 2. Again, we're still talking about likely voters, so you do have a running argument between the campaigns over what the electorate's going to look like, and the critique that the Romney campaign has offered of a lot of the public polls is they think the public polls are essentially polling some people who aren't going to vote. And when you look at the more motivated voters, the more predictable and reliable voters, that they do better. That's a question that will be answered on Election Day.
And so it gets down to get out the vote efforts. And how does that look for both sides in Wisconsin?
Yeah, I would say it gets down to both the actual organizing and mobilizing the campaigns do, and it also gets down to the motivation of voters themselves. It's not just sort of the ground game, but it's also how motivated, how intense, how enthusiastic, how energized are base Republican voters and base Democratic voters. And I think the recent history in Wisconsin is that both sides are very good at turning out their voters, and we've seen it. We saw it in the recall election, obviously a big Republican victory. We saw it in 2008 with a historic margin for the Democrats for President Obama in Wisconsin of 14 points, and we saw it on both sides in 2004. So this may look a little bit more like 2004, where both sides really seem to maximize their vote.
Now, there have been some rather wild swings in some of the polls, Marquette poll being one of them. Can you talk a little bit about why, as a consumer of polls, it's good to look at more than one poll?
Yeah, because, I mean, every poll is a statistical sampling, right? Yeah. So there's going to be sometimes what pollsters call statistical noise, which is just sort of almost random kind of variation, because you get a different sample. You can do everything right in the poll, and the methodology could completely sound, and you're going to get one result one day and one result another day, even if the underlying electorate hasn't necessarily changed that much. So you always want to look at more than one poll, and you also, because different pollsters use different methods, and they're capturing different groups of voters, and they're making different assumptions about the electorate, they're also going to come up with different results for those reasons. So, my policy is never put too much stock in one poll. I mean, Rasmussen has a poll showing the candidates tied in Wisconsin. Marquette has a poll showing Obama up by 8. NBC has a poll showing Obama up by 3. Well, look at all 3 of them and say, what does that tell us about the race? Look at the last 5 or 6 polls in Wisconsin.
So let's move to the Senate race between Tammy Baldwin and Tommy Thompson. You did a really interesting blog post this morning that looked at the numbers in the Marquette poll and a variety of polls, and found some interesting statistics regarding Tommy Thompson and his favorability, unfavorability. Talk about what you found.
Yeah, I mean, basically what happened was Tommy Thompson started the year, and Marquette started polling back in January, with a pretty good, his public image was in pretty good standing. I mean, a lot more people viewed him favorably than viewed him unfavorably, which is not surprising.
14 years as governor, cabinet secretary. Yeah.
But what happened, and that kind of held up for a good part of the year, and then he went through this difficult primary where he was attacked from the right and struggled through that primary, and then after the primary got hit by a kind of largely unopposed wave of advertising from Democrats and Democratic groups.
He was kind of out of money at that point.
Kind of out of money, couldn't really answer. So whenever you have sort of, you know, one-way flows of advertising, that's a recipe for advertising to have an effect on the race. And in some ways it's surprising because Tommy Thompson is a well-known figure, and usually the better known you are, the less vulnerable you are to having your image kind of redefined by television ads. But he took a hit. And the polling showed the race flipped in terms of Baldwin surging ahead of him. And then if you look at his own image, suddenly his negatives started outweighing his positives. And that's been the trend over the course of this campaign.
So there was some underlying weakness there that would allow that to happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you had the money factor.
Sure.
And so, you know, it's obviously a very close race. But if you just look at the underlying numbers, both candidates have much higher negatives at this point than positives because the advertising has been so negative and to some degree effective on both sides.
Well, you wrote the other day, most negative race in the country.
Yeah.
So let's move to a couple of other questions that have been sort of bandied about recently. Both may be long shots, but they're really interesting at least to think about. One is the possibility of an electoral college tie, 269 to 269. It seems very remote, but if that happened, what would the result be? How would we figure out who would become president?
Well, it goes to the House of Representatives, and then you know, there's sort of a slightly Byzantine process where, you know, each state delegation essentially casts a vote. And,
as a state?
Yeah, and so, you know, under pretty much any scenario you can imagine, I mean, that would advantage the Republicans. So it would obviously create, you know, an uproar and a lot of turmoil, just like the post-election dispute in 2000 did. So that's one recipe for a very turbulent and not too satisfying outcome for some voters. Another recipe, of course, would be a split outcome in terms of the electoral vote going one way and the
like
popular
we had
vote
in 2000.
going the other. Exactly.
Yeah. What does that mean? Which that might be a more likely scenario given that Romney seems to have more of an edge in the southern states.
Right.
Obama has an edge in the northern states, but it might not be as big of an edge. So if that happens, what would that say for whoever wins about what kind of mandate they might have to push forward their agenda?
Yeah, well, it's always open to question the mandates that the winner of an election brings, and even under the best of circumstances. What happened in 2000, if you remember, when we not only had the split outcome, but then we had the dispute over Florida. So such a huge and dark cloud over that election.
Right.
George Bush gets elected, and he basically says, I won this election, and I have a mandate.
I'm the guy. I'm going to do it.
And he kind of hit the ground running. And if you remember, he did some fairly dramatic things. He passed these big tax cuts. He was successful in kind of being very proactive and forceful.
No child left behind.
Right out of the gate.
Bipartisanship.
Exactly. So, you know, it's really what the winner makes of it. I mean, under any circumstances, you can always debate whether the electorate is sending a message in terms of a mandate, but it's really up to what the candidate does with it and what they can get through Congress.
All right, well, we'll keep following your posts at Wisconsin Voter. That's at jsonline.com, and in the paper, Craig Gilbert, Washington Bureau Chief of the Journal Sentinel. Thanks for being on 4th and State.
It's a pleasure.